Right. Greetings, everyone. Right. Okay. Well, I'm going to jump into the void. All right. Sorry, everybody. This wasn't happening just in the test right before. All right. Okay. Okay. All right. I think we might have figured out this issue. Can you guys hear me better now? Okay, great. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's always a little bit, it's like mind shift echo. Well, thank you for joining this session on telling stories about landscape and insights from media and science. My name is Willie Schubert. I'm the global director for Mongabay, which is a global conservation and environmental news outlet. And in my role with Mongabay, I oversee our editorial team. So I'm in contact with really a vast diversity of stories and also with scientists who are focused on the status of the world's most critically important landscapes. And so today we've brought together a panel of journalists who are working on this issue as well as scientists. So I'd like to briefly introduce them before we jump in today. We're going to split this conversation into two parts just because of some of the limitations of the platform. We can't have all of us on screen at the same time. But I'm going to introduce everybody up front. So the first person that's joining us today is Gustavo Filieros. He's the founder and editor of Info Amazonia, which is a new media platform dedicated to reporting and aggregating information about the Amazon basin. Recently, Gustavo's won an award from the Online News Association for an investigative report about gold mining in Venezuela that utilized a lot of the multimedia techniques he's going to be talking about. Also joining us up front is Zachary Melanson. He's the co-founder and chief storyteller at Community Forest International. Zach leads the Plant for Pemba movement of tree planters in Tanzania. And he's recently produced a documentary, an award-winning documentary called Kokota, the Islet of Hope. And it's a story about an island-wide movement to adapt and thrive in the face of climate change, which is being screened at the upcoming GLF, the Global Landscapes Forum in Bonn. From the science side, we have two people joining us. One is Professor Daniel Moody. He's a principal scientist for C4, who's previously served as the Deputy Minister of Environment for the government of Indonesia and contributed to various IPCC reports, which were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. And Moira Moliono, she's a senior associate with C4, focused on the social aspects of natural resource use, specifically the community management of forests. And, just the concept of this session is to really tease out the linkages between landscapes and storytelling, and how we use place as a way to introduce big, complex topics like climate change or deforestation at a global scale. And this is also the first Global Landscapes Forum online media workshop, and it's designed to start a long-term initiative to create a community of journalists that are supported by bringing together meetings like this, as well as support for some stories. And I'll come back to that at the end. But thanks everybody for joining, and sorry for echoing our way into the beginning. But I'd like to start, with a couple of questions for our two more media-focused panelists. And I think the first one is, how do you relate to landscape in the context of your journalism work or your storytelling? And maybe we can start with Gustavo.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm talking from Brazil. It's a pleasure to be here. Answering your question, I want to tell a little bit of the proposal we have behind InfoAmazonian. So our project, it's not only focused on one country, or the Amazon of Brazil, which is where I live and is the country which holds the largest part of the tropical rainforest, but we look at the basin. So that's of dealing with the territory which in practice has no borders, right? So the largest freshwater basin in the world has no country or nation boundaries. So we look at the territory as a whole, and it's a challenge because we're looking at, and we're dealing with 9 countries. So the way we do this is both by looking at a lot of data, satellite data, which gives you this representations, kind of this this overview, this above ground view of the territory. And the other way, it's working with networks of informants, both journalists and citizens on the ground, as a network of journalists that work in different countries. So we look at the territory, the Amazon basin, as a character, if you like. So it's treating this landscape, this territory, as something that needs to be represented as a whole. So it's not only talking about this character or this actor or this organization, but also giving a voice to the territory itself. So that's more or less how we treated the Amazon in our project.
Great. Hey everyone, I'm Zach. I'm in Eastern Canada at the moment, and really great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I think, for us, Landscape, as an organization that's mission driven to fight climate change, we kind of work to empower rural communities to thrive with nature. So landscape is inseparable from the people that live on it, and so it really frames our work. I think Gustavo brought up a good point. Landscapes are are very individual, and they can be characters in their own right. I work in 2 sort of different places. I work here in Eastern Canada around forestry. There's a lot of industrial deforestation happening in Canada at a time when we need trees more than ever. And in Zanzibar, in the archipelago, it's also an endangered forest. And and a really interesting place with such a deep history of knowledge and trade. It's just really incredible. So I think for us, when I think of landscape, I always kind of think of it with the people as well, and just how that interaction happens. The interface between people and landscape, I think, really kind of makes each aspect more rich. So, you know, when I think of the landscape and and how we approach it, it definitely is from that lens. Is you know, people that live it, because they have such an intimate interaction with it, and it kind of teases out some of the really incredible things about landscape, like you know, like the flora and the fauna. Like, how does that relate to how people are interacting with landscape? So,
well, that's interesting. I think both of you have really highlighted that type of a relationship that landscape plays between both people and the environment, and trying to understand, you know, how those connections are made and those relationships can be a place to find stories. It's also a place where lots of people research, trying to find those connections and interactions. So can you tell us a little bit more about how are you utilizing science to communicate these stories, landscape level stories?
Well, as I said, what we try to do in our work is exactly bringing science to the reporting, to the point that we call what we do geojournalism, which is a merge between geography and journalism. And I know this might sound a little bit pretentious, but it's really what we're trying to do. So we applying concepts like resolution, like cartography resolution, for example. It's very well applicable to journalism. As I was saying, like if you have an overview of the territory using satellite imagery, it's one resolution. But if you go down to a single story, a person's story, this is another resolution. So the combination of these two resolutions help us on telling this story in a better way. So you can literally zoom in and out of this territory from one level of one story to a bigger level, a bigger resolution of a satellite imagery. The other thing, of course, it's using a lot of the earth science data. So this can come again from satellite, but also from ground sensors or on water quality or water levels. So this helps us to systematically communicate a territory. One example of this is using water level data to communicate the risk of floods. This is a very important issue in some cities based in the Amazon. So distributing this data is part of our work. So looking at earth science and which is geography, at the end of the day, it's what we do to get close to narrate with some accuracy and bring science to our reporting.
Yeah, and I think on our side, it's too bad we lack the sort of scientific person on staff on our side in Tanzania. But in Canada, we have them, but we really rely on that wealth of science online to really inform our storytelling. So, you know, it's always just one aspect of how can we, you know, pull out, you know, some of the facts and are just so compelling when it comes to storytelling. Like, you know, in where I live in Canada, every time, you know, we did a deep dive into the industry and how the history of the industry on the landscape. And, you know, we've pulled together this report and basically, you know, every time a piece of land changes hands here in Eastern Canada, 95% of the time, it is clear cut, completely cut within 5 years. So, you know, it's hard to tell the stories about landscape unless you have those really compelling facts that help sort of really lead people to what's happening on landscape. And so, you know, we really, it's exceptionally important to find those things, and then also not just to have a lot of information, but also to help sort of synthesize that information. Obviously, you know, there's bias involved there, and you want to try and limit that as much as possible. But, you know, I think people need meaning making, and too much information, I think it really works for some people. But, you know, for mass appeal, I think we need to really try and do some meaning making around some of this science, and visuals, like Gustavo was saying, like the maps and that stuff is just such a really compelling and visual way to see something and to connect with it. So, yeah.
Interesting. And yeah, I have a follow-up question for you about this, because, you know, I noted that you're a storyteller who's supporting a nonprofit, which is mission-driven. And so I'm just wondering, how do you hone in on what stories are going to effectively communicate that work that you're doing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's kind of like, how do you, where do those stories come from? I find it comes from all different ways. I mean, I'm really lucky to be sort of split between two places. I think they both inform each other. Like, ideas I get about stories here in Canada, I can kind of just tweak them a little or change the frame, and they kind of make something interesting happen in my mind, or you know, they kind of relate in an interesting way to what happens in Tanzania. You know, for me, I'm always kind of interested in finding the stories, like a sort of a different take on the story. You know, with the film that we made, it was really important to you know, like, we were so inspired by our colleagues in Pemba, and we actually ended up doing work in Canada as a result of that, of being just like seeing our colleagues and seeing how great their work was. So yeah, it's I'm getting a little off topic. I guess the question was how do I find the stories? I think that, you know, through conversation, like when I'm in Tanzania, a lot of, like, we have you know, 15 staff on the ground, and they work directly with people. So I'm always, as soon as I get there, I'm always out with them and asking questions and visiting, and also having conversations with them, because they are right there. They have all the context, and they kind of tease out the stories for us. So, you know, mostly it just happens through conversation. And then I'm also kind of always, there's the larger stories like climate change and these things that inform the kind of, like, how do I say this? Those stories and the larger kind of narratives that are happening, and then the ones on the micro level, when they start to kind of link up, when I hear something at the larger level that really relates to something, a conversation I've been having, let's say at the micro level, and a linkage starts to kind of develop about how those two are connected, I think that's kind of really when we start to explore more of the stories.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And Gustavo, I mean, one of the things that you just highlighted was the importance of place and the ability to use landscape as a character. So I'm wondering, you know, in your experience, what brings an audience to a story primarily about place, and how do you kind of convince an editor that that's an appropriate framing?
Yeah, it is a challenge, because we have a lot of evidence that people connect better with single stories. So I think you really need to have this balance. So we are proposing ourselves to face this challenge of treating an ecosystem or a territory or a landscape as a character that can be narrated in a very compelling way. Of course, this is not new. I don't want to sound pretentious. If you look at the past, this comes from the tradition of natural narrating, like the natural world, and I'm recently very interested on narrations of Humboldt, and it was a fascinating thing. I understand at his time how he actually involved people from Europe to understand what was going on in America. So I think this balance today between this kind of a classical narration that we can involve with new technology, again, representing this with satellite imagery or data visualization with the ground story of the people that is affected by the transformations on that environment. It's what I think it's compelling. So climate change is a very good example. It's such a global phenomenon, as we all know, or deforestation is also, it sometimes it's a large scale phenomenon that someone might not grasp the impacts over people or communities. So what we try to do, or I think it's effective, is to establish this connection between this large environmental change and the impact of on people. And I think we have very good examples, because there are examples that are being forced on us based on the how harsh is the reality. So air pollution in China, for example, that's a large scale phenomenon. And I think it's a very compelling story, because basically it's horrible to think that people cannot go out of their houses because there's some air pollution. Something like the episode of water contamination in the US, in Flint, it's the same case. If people cannot have the basic, their basic needs of fulfilled or achieved, it's something that is very impactful. What I see as a challenge in our work, and I'm saying our because I work with the Amazon region, and I believe a lot of people who's watching this works with tropical forests, either in Indonesia or landscapes in general, is to show people that losing forests is also this kind of impact, because it's connected. So my conclusion is still it's a challenge, and we should face it, trying to establish this balance between systematic narratives and personal stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. For big issues like these, it's, one story, it's very hard to capture some of these complicated things. So it sounds like, from what I'm hearing, you can make it a little bit more digestible, a little bit more understandable or relatable if you can kind of narrow it down to some more concrete examples of something that's much larger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, just to kind of continue with you, Gustavo, I'm just wondering, you mentioned your inspiration from, Baron von Humboldt, going back hundreds of years. I know that you've been both an economics reporter and you've covered, politics in Brazil. Now you've been an environmental reporter for quite some time. I'm wondering, how did you arrive at this approach? Especially for like a more data-driven approach to storytelling at this landscape level scale of the Amazon basin.
I think what really brought me to this idea of narrating a territory, it was actually seeing some of this large scale phenomenon on satellite imagery. Because when I realized, for example, that when there's burnings in the Amazon, the south part of the continent of South America is actually affected, I thought this is really amazing, and you actually can see it. You can see visually on satellite imagery how carbon monoxide comes out of the Amazon, and because of the currents, the winds, it actually reach many kilometers south. So I thought this was an amazing phenomenon that should be narrated. And then this idea of working in partnership with journalists in different parts of the continent also was very attractive. So that's how we got to this, creating Amazonia as something that can combine these two layers of information, like physical data with a layer of stories that helps to contextualize this data. It was really a need of having a kind of systematic or or a narrative of the system, of this whole system. And of course, there's you see now attempts that don't necessarily need a visual aid, so to speak. So one of the best representations of this system was recently launched by a scientist in Brazil. It's called the Flying Rivers, which shows how this water vapor on the atmosphere in the Amazon actually helps the whole continent to have the rainfalls, which of course a lot of the agricultural production depends. So that was a very good image and a metaphor that stick to the people, because they actually grasp this idea that cities in the south, other sectors and industries in the continent depends on the water that is produced by the trees in the Amazon. So either this use of imagery or metaphors, for me, are very important to represent this territory.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And yeah, from what it sounds like, that kind of layer of stories that you're talking about, it's about providing a local context. It's providing, a manifestation of one of these kind of global changes. And, Zach, your work at Community Forests International is naturally focused at a more community level, at a local level. And so, when you're reporting or, producing videos in communities, what principles are guiding your decision-making as a storyteller?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, definitely, respect and trust. I think that when you're telling a story, you have to do it justice, and you have to really do the people their justice. I think that there are lots of cases of people just kind of having an idea of a story in their head and just kind of plowing through and creating it. I think that can be really, not only misinformed, but just but harmful in a greater context. And I think that's really, working in development and working with other communities. It's something that, we started our own organization, so we were very aware of just that relationship. And it was something that we just didn't want to perpetuate. So that continues through, when we do storytelling and, trying to find, break down, I think, stereotypes that, North and South and different things that are really can be problematic and actually aren't really just untrue. So it's really important, I think, when we go to tell stories, or at least when I tell stories, is that, to make sure that we're really accurately representing those stories and in a respectful way. So, I have it's not really fair, because I know a lot of journalists don't have the same, long-standing necessarily relationship that I have with the communities and the relationships that we've built there in Tanzania. But, I would say that that's really important. And then the relationship, you can have a long-standing relationship. It's just about the quality of how you approach, storytelling, and how you approach getting the interviews. And when you do come with a story, how, when people read it, is their name right? Is it accurate? I've seen a lot of photos of, from reporting where it's like the person's name isn't even really there, or it's not accurate. So I think that, sometimes, at least in our experience on the ground, our partners have had, people come and visit and had these experiences where it felt really extractive. So I think it's something that's worth mentioning in the context of this, telling stories about landscapes and telling stories about, the people that are inhabiting those landscapes. There is a power dynamic, and sometimes we've seen it happen that people are quite extractive. They'll come and want to tell a story and then sort of take a lot of time and resources and then end up not even really mentioning the organization at the end, or something like that, and or getting people's name completely wrong, or not. So sometimes there's not the same rigor, I think, when people are visiting our project than they would use maybe elsewhere, which is disappointing. So that's just something that I think is good to mention, because I know it's not necessarily the norm, but it does happen. So it's always good to keep that in context, I think. And, I would stress just, this is not a new thing. Like Gustavo says, nothing we're really saying is new. But, working with local people to really understand context. I think if you're from elsewhere, it takes a lot of time to get up to speed, and finding and building a relationship with people on the ground who have a lot of that insight, and having those conversations. That's where the great story is going to come from. And so it's important that you really take the time and give it the story and the people and the landscape the respect that they deserve.
Yeah, I think that's the key message, is one of respect, and also making sure that you take enough time, being a little bit more slow, especially with context that people who are in a newsroom may not understand on a day-to-day basis, that it may take some time to develop that relationship. And kind of continuing on this theme, back to Gustavo, about maybe you can give us some examples of how you've integrated some kind of ground level reporting or examples from a community with kind of this more big picture, data-driven geojournalism. Do you have any kind of specific examples of that dynamic, of how you take a specific case to illuminate a bigger picture issue?
Well, what comes to my mind, it's exactly the work, the recent work that we are doing on the it's a highway which connects the city of Porto Velho to Manaus. It's called BR 319, and a disclosure here, we publishing part of this content in English with Mongabe, with Willie, but for me, it was exactly the kind of challenge that Zach's describing. It's going to a place that's considered remote, and that by looking at just the maps and the satellite imagery, we know there's a trend of growing deforestation there. And being an environmental reporter, it's a kind of a natural thing. You go and consider deforestation as a bad thing. And I'm pretty sure if you look at through the lenses of science, that's going to be a bad thing as well. But when you go to the ground to understand the context, why people is cutting trees, what's the economy behind, what is driving that dynamic that is really pushing why authorities cannot stop that, just like showing up there and say like stop, they cannot do that. So this is a kind of a slow moving understanding of a village, which was the case. And I'm going to share the video that we did on this village, which funny enough is called Reality. So we did this video which was called Welcome to Reality, Realidade in Portuguese, which was going to this place where with less than 5,000 people, where there's a clear trend of deforestation, and grabbing these dynamics were really, really interesting. So from a journalistic perspective, our goal is not to try to show things in black and white, not creating a bad person or a good person. It's just trying to represent the way it is and creating some empathy. So if you're talking with a guy which works for a sawmill, he's saying like, well, this is my work, I believe I'm doing the right thing, but at the same time, I'm seeing that some wrongdoing is happening here, so I'm concerned. So that was our experience on the ground that I would like to share with you. I think it gives you this sense of how difficult it is to just paint things in black and white. It's not the way it is. It's much more complex than that.
Yeah.
Especially when we're dealing with the environment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's also an interesting example, going back to some of our earlier questions about how to make an editor interested, is that you have a big landscape, a massive basin, there's a road project. This is something that's new, that is known to be a driver of deforestation, something that will have a longer term consequence. And so this is why, it becomes newsworthy. And because you have some type of a new development, then you can start weaving in all these other aspects, whether it's about the livelihoods and the economy of the local area, why are they deforesting, whether it's about the relationship with the people who are in the places that are not yet connected to the road. And, we have a few questions from our participants, and, they kind of also get to some of these questions, like, okay, so you tell the story of the people who are in the sawmill town of Realidade, and then, you try to reach the people who, often indigenous communities who haven't yet been affected by the road. And so, I'm wondering, Zach, what are the potential problems for a reporter or things that you've faced? This is a question from our audience, Nevedita. What are the possible problems a reporter will face while covering a changing landscape at a local level, specifically an indigenous community that is involved in the process of changing a landscape? And I think that can be, if I understand correctly, potentially causing deforestation, or, in the case of Zach, reforestation. So how do you cover a changing landscape in the context of a community? What are the potential problems? I think that's the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's, there are a host of potential problems. In Zanzibar, in our work there, there can always be issues with government, and at the community level, I think that, people cannot want journalists there and storytelling to happen. And then there's also people who do want journalists and storytelling to happen. And I think this kind of fits in with what Gustavo was saying a little bit. Is like these aren't really black and white, and so if there's deforestation happening, it's like there likely are drivers and reasons for that at the local level, and sort of approaching the interview process in a way that isn't kind of putting people in boxes. And threatening, I think, and trying to be as non-threatening as possible, and just trying to understand the situation, and especially if you know that there is a lot of tension. I've never really worked in conflict zones, so I can't speak to that specifically. I've never felt personally in danger, covering anything I've ever done. But I think that you'll get a much better story if you can approach it in a way that kind of recognizes that there is that it's not good and evil, it's not wrong and right, just like the interesting part there is the complexity, and trying to kind of let people tell you where they're coming from, and then you're if they feel like you're actually listening to them, you're going to get a lot more information, rather than if they feel that you're there to expose them or to cause them problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, embracing the complexity when you're thinking about changes at a landscape level can really help. I know that we always have a desire to try and simplify things for our audience and our readers so that they can understand and interpret things. So embracing that complexity can be challenging, but I think it's one of the things that's very motivating about this style of reporting. I have one more question, or a couple more questions. They're really starting to come in. So one question I think is for Gustavo. It's from Jaco, and it's if you can tell us a case where you went to the field with an idea or some expectations about what the story was from a more journalistic perspective, and you had to substantially change your view once you arrived.
Right. Yeah, well, I have one story that I always tell. I'm gonna even try to get the picture for you. I don't think I can share pictures here, but maybe I have a link I can share. Anyway, more than 10 years ago, when I was really starting at going more often to the Amazon, this was 2006, I was a reporter at this time for an outlet in Brazil called O Eco. I was sent to the state of Acre, which is in the Amazon, to tell the story about this reserve, which is a kind of what we call extractive reserve. Is something that is a sustainable use reserve would be a good translation, which was created in after Chico Mendes, which is a famous environmentalist in Brazil, was killed. Actually, it's 30 years this year. He was killed, and he had this philosophy that people could live out of the forest, like extracting rubber or Brazil nuts. So they created this reserve, the first one, with this characteristic, sustainable use, to maintain the communities there. So my story was basically to go there and see how things were not working. So my previous idea, that the research I had, it was that people were not actually making. So they were changing forests for cattle ranching because there was not enough income to maintain this reserve. So I went there with a kind of a pre-idea that something really bad was happening, and it was. But what changed my view, it was when I went to one of the properties, the small properties, and I, by chance, I was very lucky. I got to a place where the guy was just chopping down all his area to plant, and he was doing this alone. And what really changed my view from that point in a more systematic way, because I still keep this view, that guy was not just cutting trees because he wanted it. He just needed, deforestation was a need, and I couldn't see he wanted that because it was such a tough job. And I remember this feeling of holding his hand and say like, "Hi, I'm Gustavo from São Paulo," and his hand was so thick. And when he said his age to me, where I think it was like 46 or 50, he looked like 60, because it was a very hard work he was doing there. I know this sounds a little bit naive, but imagine I was like 25 or 24 years old, and I was going there and seeing, first time in my life, a guy like chopping trees and burning 1 hectare alone. So this experience of being there, it was like being in a very tough place, and seeing the situation of that guy made me think a lot about why deforestation could not be stopped, at least with these small landholders. And so that it was an important experience to me, to witness this moment where people were cutting trees and see that it was not an easy job.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Gustavo. And, I've got just one more question, because we're about to switch over to having Daniel and Moira join for the second half of this session. So I want to ask just a broad question, since we have an interdisciplinary group with us. And I'm just wondering, where do you find inspiration for your stories, for your work? It could be, whether this is a feature article that you're working on, a research topic, or a project. Where do you find inspiration for your storytelling?
Well, for myself, I definitely find inspiration in sort of this need, or this call to action that we have on our planet right now. I think that with climate change and with communities and with the growing divide between rich and poor, that to me really drives me. And also it's a little bit different because, again, we're a mission-driven organization, and that's part of the reason why I started the organization, because it's just such an urgent need. But that you know, that want to see action, and also to kind of change the framework and inspire people to action. So, you know, for me, trying to, you know, climate change is just so incredibly, you know, depressing, and it can be because there's these massive changes happening. But, you know, I'm inspired when I can find stories where people are actually pushing back, and where there's actually some real tangible thing happening that gives us hope and moves us towards a solution. So for me, that's kind of what really drives me, is like, how do we solve these problems, and how can we tell stories that help inspire us, give us courage, you know, not only hope, but courage to actually do something about where we're at. And I think that storytelling is such a fundamental part of you know, sense making and who we are as people, that, you know, maybe it is naive, but, you know, in some ways, but hopefully through, you know, some of these telling of these stories are showing people what's possible, that it somehow moves us closer to action, and moves us closer to actually affecting the world. Because, you know, at the end of the day, I want to see a planet where, you know, people are living more in harmony with nature, and not in a utopian sense, but one where, like, we don't just destroy nature or put it in a park, where we actually, like, understand that we have to interact with the planet in a way that's good for both of us, for people and planet. And, you know, on the science side, I know you were segueing to science. It's just like, science is just such like the things that we're learning now about science, and about, you know, interconnectivity, and about, like, landscape level, you know, just the beauty of our planet is just incredible. And that also inspires me, because, you know, it's, I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose that beauty. So.
Yeah. And Gustavo, you could take that more inspirational kind of question, or we also have a few more questions from the audience. They've really been coming in, so thank you all for sharing. We have a practical question about using landscape as a character. Do you have a preference before we switch? I think this will be the last one before we change over. Do you want to tackle inspiration, or do you want to answer if you have a checklist on how to view landscape as a character?
I'm seeing three questions that were not answered here. I can try to address. One is about from Jeffrey about security. I think Zach said that he had no issues with security so far. Maybe if he has something, he might tell us. But I haven't had a being directly threat, but we do feel sometimes not very welcome in some areas where there's illegal activities like timber, like logging and deforestation. And I think the technique that just Zach mentioned of trying to create some connection with your source by not judging, just telling them that you want to hear their story, their side, which is totally true, opens a lot of doors. But the first reaction sometimes in one of these forest areas, you might know, I'm pretty sure a lot of people here work in these areas, like with your fancy car or with your recording devices and everything, people just look at you and say like, so they want to know more. And so there are risks that are more subtle than you might think. And there's some message that you can grasp in the air. So I won't be very specific about that, but yeah, there's some risks involved of doing this. On the checklist, I think the one, Sahana, one of the ways of doing this is trying to think about these different resolutions, as I was saying, like try to do one, better than thinking as a journalist, I would say, thinking about an ecologist. If you have to describe an ecosystem with these different entities, which are the parts of these ecosystems? So I have one story that I believe I tried to do this, which was about catfish in the Amazon. So there's a wonderful book years ago, I don't know if you can find it, it's called Catfish Connection, which shows how a catfish in various environments from the Mekong and the Amazon, it's related with the connectivity of rivers. So building dams can be really damaging for catfish because they migrate hundreds of kilometers to spawn. So this is an example where by telling the story with one species, you might tell the story of a whole ecosystem. So that's a way I would think about the resolution from the one-to-one. The one-to-one, let's say it's a story, a species, to a larger resolution, 1 to, I don't know, 50,000 would be like a satellite imagery view, something like this. What landscape story are you most proud of and why? Julia, mine one, it would be this one about the catfish, exactly. Unfortunately, it's in Portuguese. I can share. I don't know if you would be able to translate it, but it's exactly where I think I could exercise this this idea of like looking at one species, which is so important for a whole ecosystem.
All right. Well, thank you, Gustavo and Zach. Really appreciate your time and your insights. I think we're about to switch over. Thank you also to the audience, everybody, for your questions. Just a quick reminder, we're going to be joined in a second by Professor Daniel Moody, who's a principal scientist for C4 based in Indonesia, and also Moira Moliono, who's also a senior associate with C4 Indonesia. Hi, Moira.
Hi.
And I think Daniel is about to join as well. I see a black box. So why don't we just jump right in? And we're going to go kind of back to the beginning a little bit and just, ask about how you relate to landscape in the context of your work. And maybe we can start with Moira, because I'm not seeing Daniel quite yet. So maybe we can start with you, Moira.
Oh, can I put my face?
It's in the background.
What to click? If I want to put the picture.
I think you're coming up, Daniel. You might just need to turn on your the camera.
Yeah, it should be a toggle to click that, right?
Oh. Looks like he needs to reconnect. So, Moira, why don't we start with you?
Well, landscape in the course of my work. Basically, we know that in forests, especially, everything that relates to forest is outside the forest. So you cannot look only on the forest itself. So even if we talk climate change, we know that happens more at a landscape scale rather than at a place. And similarly, if I talk community forestry, we are talking about what is beyond the community and affects the community itself. So that is how landscape play a role. This is echoing.
Oh.
There's a delay in speaking.
Okay. Sorry about that, Moira. But it's interesting to hear you use the word scale again. I think scale and resolution was the theme of the past 45 minutes or so. And, I'm just wondering your relationship towards, journalism or storytelling. In your experience, what role can storytelling play in communicating science? How have you seen that play out in the places that you're interested in?
Well, I think if you talk landscapes and the different scales, then we also come back to the complexity. And we are not very good in explaining complexity. So we will rely on the journalists to translate our science into language that people will more understand. Also, journalists come at more places probably than we do. They talk to different people, and I think the media is more present these days in people's life than scientists.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to check back with Daniel if you can hear us, or if you're muted. I just don't want to skip over your...
I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can't see you, but I think that's okay for now. Do you want to respond to the question about how you relate to landscape in the context of your work?
Yeah, well, I've been working a lot in wetland. And usually people ask what kind of wetland you're working with and why is it important for people. So if I try to changing land use in wetland, it's very, very massive. And not only the area, but also the consequences of this very fragile ecosystem, namely peatland and mangrove. So when we were talking about deforestation, most people are talking about removal of biomass and carbon dioxide from above ground biomass. But if we are talking about wetland, most of these carbon are stored below the ground. And 5-6 times higher than those stored above the ground. So the story would be how to maintain that below ground carbon in wetland. So managing wetland landscape really is to try to keep this huge storage of carbon. Very noisy.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like some people are having a little challenge hearing you, Daniel. So
okay.
I'm going to ask a more specific question about the types of questions that you hope journalists would ask you more often about your work, Daniel. And let's just see if we can hear you a little bit better. But what questions do you wish more journalists would ask you about your work? You've done quite a bit working at a policy level.
Yeah, with that kind of background, I just said, why is it important to maintain carbon in wetland? And how can we do that? So that kind of question normally are managing landscape of that kind really is to try to make the below carbon sustainable in the ground. And in many practices, people trying to cultivate the land and damaging the storage just below the ground. Namely, practice fish pond, shrimp pond, those kind of stuff really are very damaging in terms of carbon storage in mangrove area. And normally, people trying to clean the ground by burning. It's not only above ground biomass and carbon which are removed, but also carbon.
Yeah. So it was a little difficult to hear, but just to summarize briefly, it's about valuing the landscapes underground as well, not just what you see, but that there's stories to be told about essentially what you can't see, but the processes that are occurring, in the soil, interacting with the water. Now I'm going to go back to Moira, and you used an interesting word, about this relationship between science and storytelling, and that was translation. How to, the journalists play a role in translating research for more general audiences. And I'm just wondering, how do you translate your research when you're communicating with different types of people? And is there any kind of principles that you have used or that you think about that can benefit the journalists who are on this webinar in that translation process?
Well, we have in the last couple of years, there's a lot of emphasis in how to communicate the science. So rather than scientific articles, we are also sort of writing the science up in more simple policy briefs or info briefs using a lot of graphics and pictures, things like that. And some of us are also using videos and things like that. So basically, we've tried a lot of things, but often it's still the simple bringing people together, doing the shared learning approach that makes the more impact, which is not very practical because it only involves fewer people. But on the other hand, it's more effective in my experience.
So that is often, involving more in-person communication and two-way type of communication is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Interesting. And so, I'm interested to hear, I know that you've studied, forestry and also more social sciences as well. And, the role of journalists in sharing information and that's relevant to decision making is something that I believe that you've researched and studied. How has that kind of information exchange affected the outcomes of initiatives like RED, which have pretty diverse goals, as well as diverse kind of constituencies from like a policymaking audience at an international level to more local communities who are forest dwelling, who are influenced by these types of changes?
I'm not sure that I understand the questions. You're asking the role of journalists in conveying the information.
No, I'm asking, in your experience, how has information sharing impacted the results of some of these projects that are meant to address climate change through practices like RED or RED+, so reducing emissions through reduced deforestation and land degradation?
Yeah, I have to admit that we haven't been very effective in impacting policies directly. I think it has been a very slow process that in the policy making, in Indonesia at least, there was a time when the policymakers were listening more to scientists and journalists about the RDD. But climate change, especially if you link it to deforestation, is something that moved slowly. And so people react more to urgent things. So if there's a big disaster, people react more. But if you link it then to climate change, the urgency of the link has been lost because it moves so slowly. Even though everybody the science shows and journalists have told people that climate change is real and is happening. It also takes a real effort to do this, and not many parties are willing to exert the effort.
Mm-hmm.
So it's knowing and not knowing.
Mm-hmm. But from what it sounds like is that the timeliness is very important for relevance, for information to be relevant to a decision. And that's one of the major challenges for reporting on kind of big processes like climate change that are slow moving, if I am hearing correctly.
Yes, and that is where journalists have the advantage of scientists, because they can move more quickly and take the opportunity faster.
Mm-hmm. And Daniel, I'm going to try and come back to you, and hopefully the connection will be stable. So, we're talking a lot about complex science. And so I'm wondering, from your experience as a scientist, what advice do you think would help journalists who are trying to communicate these complex topics that have an impact at a kind of a large scale? For example, like, how should a journalist approach communicating a global issue like climate change, or conversely, something that's more regional in scope, like, destruction of peatlands, that has a more local impact but is connected to a global process? So, I mean, what advice do you have to journalists who are trying and may not be trained in, as much science as you have been? What advice do you have for them to communicate these complex topics?
Telling the story is very important to communicate researching well to the audience. Now, if we are touching the issue of audience, like policymakers, it's a completely different story that you have to convey. And for us, as scientists, we've been very much concerned on the production or revealing numbers and data, credible one, possible. But yeah, storytelling can be damaging if it is not backed up based on evidence, science, and real. Sorry, noisy when I was
think
speaking.
we could hear you. You were mentioning the importance of reporting needs to be backed up with evidence, and I think in media there's a tendency to sensationalize certain things, and especially if there's pressure in an editorial sense to make a story seem more like potentially bigger than it may be. So if you've seen that in reporting, what I guess what do you wish that journalists would kind of get to focus on to address some of those issues of challenges? I know that we all want to use evidence in our reporting, but do you have any more specific advice on how to approach?
Yeah, I think giving an example is one way of expressing or revealing the information or complex processes. For example, if you're talking about emission from deforestation of mangrove, which cause a lot of carbon emitted, somewhere around 20 100 million ton. It's very difficult to imagine how big is that. But by having a different figure, like which is equivalent to 30 million cars on the road, that makes things. And way of telling the story, in one hand, is strictly based on numbers, and on the other hand, it's driven by the fact that it is unimaginable if you boldly say the figure or units that the scientists will provide.
Yeah. So part of the translation process is sharing statistics or scientific information in ways that are more relatable for your audience, and that translation process is audience specific. So what may work for one outlet that's more focused on a specialization may be different than somebody who's reporting in a more general news context. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving a little bit, and we've talked a lot, especially in the first session, about the importance of more human aspects of landscape stories, community aspects, especially for people who are often more dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods and making sure that, like that's been a point from our previous participants, Gustavo and Zach. And more, I'm wondering from you, from your perspective as a researcher, why do journalists need to seek out the participation or inclusion of communities in the media narrative about the landscapes where they live?
I think it's probably the communities in these landscapes that are affected the most, but also the blamed for a lot of deforestation, forest degradation, which is not always true, because sometimes there are drivers beyond them. But their stories need to be heard, because their perspective also affects how the landscape will be managed in the future.
Yeah, and maybe this also comes back to the question that we heard earlier from Nivedita about, if you have advice about a situation, or if you've experienced often a conflicting perspective in locations where a reporter is covering a changing landscape, where a local community or indigenous community is itself involved in the process of, say, deforestation. What advice would you give a journalist who's trying to report on a situation like that?
I have a story to tell, very recent one. I'm working in a sinking coastal area in north of Java. And when I'm trying to put the people perspective in this kind of report, but to understand why this thing happened, but a common accusation or assumption is being related to sea level rise. In fact, there are multiple causes of it. Certainly, sea level rise is happening. But at the same time, in this particular landscape, in fact, it's covered hundreds of kilometers area. Mangrove has been removed for particular reasons, especially fish pond and shrimp pond and things like that. Aquaculture is very rampant in the area. But at the same time, fresh water is also withdrawn. So the possibility for the surface to subside. Sea level is rising, but at the same time, also subsiding. And the worst piece is that the removal of vegetation like mangrove will lose the opportunity to build the land, because mangrove is no land builder. It can trap them, and at the same time it will also protect the hinterland from rising sea level. So the immediate answer is mainly by government is to invest on the dikes. Millions of dollars are invested to build the dikes and protection in the area. But the local community said that's useless. If you keep spending your money like that, it's better to rescue people here. So that story really are very intriguing, and we go to the field and trying to understand what's the process. And I believe it's not going to be short and quick to find what's the problem and how to solve this problem, because there are so many different objectives in this case. Community has different objectives. Government has different objectives. Private sector who is this fish pond have different objectives. So this conflicting objective in most cases has to be open out, and one needs to sit together and find out what's the best solution for that. So again, from research point of view, you have to really raise right question in order to get
Thank you, Daniel. And I've got another question kind of coming back to our maybe some of the challenges. So I'm just wondering, if you've experienced any challenges or what some of the main obstacles are when communicating about this kind of landscape scale issue. More of that?
Well, it's complex, and it is multidimensional, multi-sectoral, multi-level, and that is of course very difficult to convey to people. And if we go back to your earlier question, of course, local communities have their life to live, and they are not all stewards of the environment, but they are also not all destroyer of the environment. So it's important to also know the perspective of both them as people that look after the environment, also people that use the environment, also people that might be on the one hand helpless because surrounding them all the other drivers push them in a corner. So that is also a story which need to be told, but also their agency, their attempt to survive, basically. And this is then playing out in the larger complexity of climate change itself. And of course, one other challenge is, of course, to explain the different roles people play and also the different responsibilities, because sometimes the stories that are told is people in the course of their livelihood destroying the forest, but then all the responsibility to rehabilitate or restore is also put on them. So the challenge is how to bring these different perspectives, and also in such a way that people will understand and think of something that can be done rather than something to blame others.
Mm. Yeah, that can be a big challenge when dealing with very complex topics, because you spend so much time trying to convey reality that it's then trying to figure out what can be done is often not considered, or is an afterthought, not given as much time because of how challenging it can be to deal with the complexity. And kind of speaking about some of those kind of potential solutions, I'm just wondering, Moira, where do you get your inspiration for your work? Where do you find inspiration?
Usually it's the brainstorming with other scientists in our team. So, for example, talking about social forestry and what it means, and then coming up with thinking of a larger question of inequality, for example, that came out of talking with your friends, discussing these things. Mostly. Sometimes you just bump into something worth investigating.
Great. So I think we've covered most of the questions. If there are, if there are any other questions from the audience, please feel free to share. But otherwise, I think we might be able to end a few minutes early. And yeah, I apologize for the technical challenges. This is the first one of these kind of online gatherings. It is a introduction to the upcoming Global Landscapes Forum in Bonn, which, for the journalists on this call, will be available on live stream through the Global Landscape Forum website. Also, if you have ideas for landscape level stories, you can share them through the kind of the link on this forum, and potentially get some funding for stories available through this new community that's being set up by the Global Landscapes Forum. Yeah, prize. Yeah, a prize. Not like a stipend, but if you share, a story, a podcast, video, photos, there are prizes related to that. So please check on the Global Landscapes Forum website, and thanks for joining us today, everybody.